What you see at a modern church potluck and what used to come off those Sunday tables are not the same thing.
I have helped prepare fellowship meals more times than I can easily count, not as a visitor, but as one of the women who started cooking on Friday. What sat on those tables was not decorative. It was functional, specific, and in many cases gone now, even from the communities that once made it. A soup thickened by nothing but rubbed flour and egg. A bread that required 3 days before Sunday to produce. A spread so old that most younger women have never tasted it.
Stay until the end. The final item disappeared not because it was difficult, but because the morning it required no longer exists.
Salt rising bread. This bread did not rise because you wanted it to. It rose because you had done everything correctly for 3 days beforehand. Salt rising bread is leavened not with yeast, but with a fermented starter. Cornmeal or sometimes potato, held in warm water with a pinch of salt until it begins to work. Then fed again. Then incorporated into a dough that had to be kept at exactly the right temperature or the whole thing stopped. The hosting family's most experienced baker made this bread. Younger women often could not produce it reliably enough to bring it to a church table. The crumb was dense and slightly chewy. The crust thin. The smell was sharp, almost cheesy, nothing like yeast bread. And it announced itself before you sliced it. People who grew up with it recognized that smell as the sign of a serious kitchen. People who did not grow up with it sometimes stepped back. Commercial yeast made the 3-day process unnecessary. The smell became unfamiliar, then off-putting, then forgotten. Virtually no one under 60 can reliably produce this bread today, even in the most conservative communities. A handful of older women still maintain the starter knowledge, and when it appears at a traditional fellowship table, it means something specific about that household's commitment to the old standard. 3 days of watching and waiting for a bread most people now cannot identify by smell. That is how much the table used to ask of you. If the bread was the foundation, the spread that went on it was older than most people realize. Number 9. Lard and molasses spread. Before peanut butter was something every family kept in the pantry, there was this. It sounds wrong until you taste it, and then it sounds like something you should have known about. Rendered leaf lard, whipped while warm until pale and smooth, then stirred with dark molasses, blackstrap sometimes, dark enough to turn the whole mixture a deep brown black. A pinch of salt. That was the spread that went on bread at fellowship tables before peanut butter was affordable or reliably available. It provided fat and sugar calories to a congregation that had been sitting still for 3 hours and would return to physical work by mid-afternoon. The flavor was not sweet like jam, not sharp like cheese, something older and more specific, earthy, rich, with the molasses doing something particular against the neutral lard. In older community records and the handwritten pages of early Pennsylvania Dutch household books, this combination appears matter-of-factly, the way you would note any common table item. Peanut butter became affordable after the Second World War, shelf-stable, easy, and the lard spread stepped aside without anyone declaring it finished. Lard fell further out of favor in the 1960s and 1970s, and by the time anyone thought to ask about what had come before the peanut butter, the women who remembered it were very old or gone. Nobody retired this spread. Peanut butter simply arrived and the older thing moved out of the way. Most of what disappeared from these tables did not fail. It disappeared because something more convenient arrived before anyone wrote down what had been there. The recipe was in the woman's hands. When her hands stopped, the recipe stopped. Dried corn soup. Fresh corn soup and dried corn soup are not the same dish. They share a name and nothing else. One tastes like summer, the other tastes like summer remembered in February. Pennsylvania Dutch kitchens dried sweet corn in low ovens or on wooden trays through late summer, held at gentle heat for hours until the kernels turned deep golden and chewy, and the sugars caramelized into something concentrated and specific, stored in cloth bags, reconstituted through winter in broth made from ham bone or chicken, sometimes finished with a little cream. The resulting soup was thick, intensely flavored, and unlike anything made with canned or frozen corn. The drying step created a flavor that cannot be approximated by any modern shortcut. This is the practical problem. The recipe survives in older PA Dutch cookbooks, but it cannot be executed without corn you dried yourself the previous August. Almost no household does that anymore, which makes the dish functionally extinct even for people who want to make it. It was a staple of winter and early spring fellowship meals, when the garden was months away and the pantry carried the congregation. A small number of older women in conservative communities still dry their own corn. The soup appears occasionally at very traditional gatherings and is being documented by Pennsylvania Dutch food historians. but it is not an active revival. You cannot make this soup without last August. That is why it is gone. Number 7. Cup cheese. This cheese did not smell polite. It was not supposed to. It was supposed to taste like something a farm had made with its own milk and its own patience. Cup cheese, sometimes called Schmierkäse in its fresh form, though aged cup cheese is a different thing, was made from naturally soured whole milk. The curds were cooked down slowly with butter, sometimes a little baking soda, and salt until they melted into a smooth, amber-colored spread with a sharp, deeply savory smell. Served cold in small crocks as a condiment on bread at the fellowship table. Modern church tables have cream cheese. Older ones had cup cheese. They are not the same tradition. Cream cheese is mild, commercial, and neutral. Cup cheese announced the farm it came from the moment you lifted the crock lid. The problem is the milk. Pasteurized, homogenized commercial milk cannot sour naturally the way raw milk from a farm dairy does. The specific fermentation that produces cup cheese requires milk behavior that commercial dairy has eliminated. Younger generations in most communities have no access to the right milk and no memory of that particular smell being desirable rather than alarming. A few families with dairy herds in the most conservative communities still produce it. For everyone else, it is a memory food, something elderly women describe rather than serve. Every crock tasted like the farm it came from. That is exactly what disappeared when the farms changed. A fellowship table in the older tradition was built from what each household produced. The bread came from the grain, the cheese came from the dairy, the dried corn came from the garden. The spread came from the rendering pot and the molasses jug. Nothing had traveled far. Everything had taken time. Number 6. Saffron bread. People see saffron now and think of expensive restaurant cooking. Where I grew up, it was what you steeped in warm water on Saturday so the bread would be ready for Sunday. Pennsylvania Dutch settlers brought saffron cultivation from Europe, and Lancaster County had a documented local saffron industry through the 18th and into the 19th century. When a community grows its own saffron, it is not a luxury. It is a pantry item. And the bread it produced, enriched dough with butter and eggs, the saffron water stirred in until the whole loaf turned deep golden, was the hosting family's signature at the fellowship table. The crumb was soft and slightly sweet, richer than plain bread, with a mild, floral, earthy flavor that was impossible to mistake. The color alone drew attention on a plain table, and the knowledge required was precise. Too little saffron, and the bread was pale and ordinary. Too much, and it crossed into medicinal. The baker had to know. When local cultivation stopped, imported saffron became expensive, and the tradition broke. Younger bakers had no experience with the flavor and no access to affordable saffron. A few families maintain the bread specifically as a preservation practice, and it appears occasionally at heritage events. But as a standard church hosting bread, it is gone. The bread was golden before it went into the oven. That is what saffron does, and that is what this community used to grow in its own gardens. Number 5. Rivl soup. Chicken corn soup gets remembered. Rivl soup gets forgotten. The difference is that one has chicken in it, and the other requires you to understand that the rivl itself is the point. A rivl is made by rubbing flour and egg together between the palms until small, rough pieces form and drop into simmering broth. Not a dumpling, not a noodle. Something older and more specific, made by hand directly over the pot. In the better-known chicken corn version, rivls are supporting players. In plain rivl soup, just seasoned broth, sometimes from a ham bone, with rivls and nothing else, the cook's ability to produce the rivl correctly is the entire meal. This version of the soup appeared at fellowship meals during lean seasons and in households where the chicken could not be spared. It required almost nothing: flour, egg, water, or plain broth, salt, dense enough to fill, honest in flavor, a pale golden broth with soft, slightly chewy flour egg drops that absorbed the liquid and became something more than the sum of their parts. The richer chicken corn version became the standard as chicken became inexpensive and always available. Plain rivl soup read as too spare, too associated with scarcity. And because younger generations never learned to make rivls at all, the simpler version became doubly inaccessible. A soup with nothing in it but what your hands put there. That is either very poor cooking or very good cooking, and the difference is the rivl. Plain food is not simple food. A rivl requires hands that know the right texture. Dried corn requires August work done correctly. Saffron bread requires knowing how much is enough. The plainness was never the easy part. The plainness was the standard. Number 4, Schnitz und Knepp. This dish has a name people laugh at. Nobody laughs after they eat it, and almost nobody serves it at a church table anymore, which is its own kind of loss. Dried apple slices, Schnitz, soaked overnight until soft, then simmered with a smoked ham hock until the broth carries both apple sweetness and ham smoke together. Flour and baking powder dumplings dropped in by the spoonful, the lid set on, 10 minutes of patience. The dumplings absorb the combined liquid from below. The apples surrender their concentrated flavor into the ham broth. The ham falls apart. The church meal version came from households that still dried their own apples in fall. The woman who started the ham simmering Saturday and dropped the dumplings Sunday morning before the wagon left. A complete meal from preserved pantry ingredients. Nothing purchased, nothing perishable. The dish requires dried apples, not fresh. Fresh apples produce an inferior and entirely different result. Since almost no household dries its own apples anymore, the recipe exists in books but cannot be properly executed. The ingredient is technically available in some specialty stores, but the understanding of what it should taste like, concentrated, almost smoky sweet from the drying, does not come with the bag. Every ingredient in this pot came from something the farm produced and preserved. That is not poverty. That is a complete system. Number 3, church roast. You knew it was a significant day when the roasting pans came out. Each one fed a table. You needed 20 of them. There is no version of this dish that works for 4 people on a Tuesday. Cubed homemade bread and stewed chicken pulled from the bone, baked together in large flat pans with celery, onion, butter, eggs, and enough rich broth to soak through everything. Salt, pepper, sometimes a breath of sage. Soft and moist inside, lightly browned where it met the pan edge. Savory and buttery with the smell of a harvest table, chicken and bread, and something communal that has no single ingredient to account for it. This is the centerpiece of Amish wedding meals in Lancaster County, and it is almost entirely unknown anywhere else. The scale makes it impossible to replicate casually. It was coordinated by experienced older women who knew by sight how much broth the bread would absorb, who worked in organized shifts, and who produced 20 pans for 300 people without a written schedule. The cooking knowledge lives in a shrinking number of older women. As communities change and weddings incorporate outside catering, the roast is among the first things to quietly step aside. It cannot be outsourced without the event becoming something different. It was not the fanciest thing on the table. It required the most people to make it. The food that held these communities together was never meant to be remembered by outsiders. It was meant to be eaten, repeated, and handed forward. The problem is that handing forward requires someone to receive, and the receiving stopped before anyone realized the giving was almost finished. Number 2, Ponhaws. Scrapple you can still buy in a store. Ponhaws made from a shared community butchering, carried to a church table still warm from the morning. That is something else entirely, and it is gone. Ponhaws is the Pennsylvania Dutch name for what is broadly called scrapple, cooked pork scraps and cooking broth stirred with cornmeal until thick, seasoned with salt, pepper, sage, sometimes marjoram, then poured into loaf pans and chilled until firm, sliced cold and fried in lard until the outside crisped dark brown. The inside stayed soft, savory, faintly herbed, with a specific cold morning smell, not quite bacon, not quite sausage, something older. The version that mattered was made collectively. Women processed the fresh scraps from the community butchering while the men finished the work outside. The Ponhaws was among the first things prepared because it used material that could not wait. It appeared at the fellowship meal that followed the butchering, made that morning from that animal by these women, for these people. Zero waste from a day of hard seasonal labor. Commercial scrapple preserved the form. It did not preserve the transaction. One you purchase, the other you owe. Communal butchering declined as commercial meat became available year-round. The church butchering day meal disappeared with the practice. Where communal butchering still occurs in very conservative communities, the shared meal sometimes persists, but it is increasingly rare even there. The store sells scrapple. Nobody sells the morning it came from. Number 1, homemade bread and apple butter from the Frolic. The bread and the apple butter are still here. You can buy both. What is gone is the October morning when women stood at a copper kettle for 6 hours and made enough to last a congregation through winter. That morning is not for sale. Apple butter made at a frolic is not the same product sold in tourist shop jars. The frolic was a community gathering, multiple households contributing apples, cider, and labor. The kettle set up outdoors. The mixture stirred without stopping from morning until it thickened and darkened into something dense and deeply spiced. Cinnamon, cloves, allspice, the apples themselves cooked past recognition into a concentrated, almost smoky sweet spread with the faint trace of an outdoor fire in the flavor. Poured hot into jars, distributed among the families who had helped make it. That apple butter then appeared at every fellowship meal through the following year. It was spread on the hosting family's bread, plain homemade loaves baked the same week, and together they were the quiet center of every Sunday table. Everything else on the table varied by season and household. The bread and the apple butter did not. The frolic as a social institution has declined sharply. Many younger women in Amish communities have never participated in one. The product survived. The October morning, the copper kettle, the conversation about whose daughter was getting married in November, and the relationships maintained through 6 hours of shared work, those are largely gone. Some communities preserve the frolic deliberately as a heritage practice now, which is a different thing than it being simply how October worked. The jar is easy to find. The morning it came from is not. After a fellowship meal, the table looks like this: breadcrumbs, an apple butter jar with a knife resting across the lid, the soup pot carried back through the kitchen door, the folding tables going out to the wagon. The food was gone in 40 minutes. Some of it took a summer to produce. The silence after the meal is its own kind of testimony. If any of these dishes appeared somewhere in your family's history, under this name or another, in your grandmother's kitchen or your church basement or a handwritten card nobody can fully read anymore, tell me below. Which one did you grow up eating? Which recipe was never written down? Which one should come back? A copper kettle cooling in an autumn field, a folded cloth beside an empty jar, morning light through a kitchen window, and nobody standing at the stove.